part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole. I have been so excited about this film since it was first announced. Some of my friends literally have a joke going that I control Hollywood, and this film being made and having Jason Isaacs in it is one of their biggest pieces of proof. A few years ago, there was a musical based on the novel Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris in Chichester, England. And one of our friends, Rhiannon, worked on the stage management team. And it opened literally the day after my flight to move back from London. But I did get to interview some of the cast members about the show, even though I didn't get to see it. And I did finally get to watch it whenever they streamed their pro shot during the pandemic. But to prepare for my interviews, I read the novel that it was based on, and I was so absolutely charmed by it. So when they announced that this movie was happening, I was thrilled, especially because, as our listeners know, both Maggie and I are huge Focus Features fans.
we are. So Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris is directed and produced by Anthony Fabian from a screenplay that he co-wrote with Carol Cartwright, Keith Thompson, and Olivia Hettried. I think that's how you say her last name. It stars Leslie Manville, Isabel Huppert, Lambert Wilson, Alba Baptista, Lucas Bravo, Ellen Thompson, Rose Williams, and Jason Isaacs. It is based on Paul Gallico's 1958 novel by the same name, and is, of course, another one of our beloved Focus feature films.
So what did you think?
Oh my gosh, I loved this movie so much. It was such a delight. It's kind of funny, my back-to-back films are basically Thor, Love and Thunder, and then this, and I was just riding on a coaster of just good vibes and feeling good about being at the cinemas, which was just really fun. Also, I got pastries beforehand. We got little fancy pastries beforehand, which was very nice.
Aww.
Which definitely even more so sweetened the deal. But I loved everything about this. My mom adored it as well. It was truly just a post-war Cinderella story that's just so wrapped up in joy and self-discovery and importance and finding your place and making changes and just so many good stories within this story that just really warmed my heart. And then Jason Isaacs just so pretty in this film. I have always loved Jason Isaacs. At the end of the movie, when the credits rolled, there was this row of women probably my age that went, "Is that Lucius Malfoy?" And I just want to be that was Captain Hook. Not to gatekeep Jason Isaacs, but I've loved this man.
Do you know the first movie I remember seeing him in?
Which one is it? Which one?
It's The Patriot.
Oh, I love that movie.
My crush on Jason Isaacs was born out of his role in The Patriot, which is the strongest, get thee to a therapist I've ever heard.
I have a very vivid memory that, I wanted to watch The Patriot because I found out he was in it. This was back when, you went to Blockbuster to rent a movie. Yeah. And my mom thought it was Heath Ledger that I was wanting The Patriot for. And then I was like, sure, we'll go with that.
I also don't know why my parents let me watch The Patriot as young as I did, because I had two major crushes who are in The Patriot. One is Jason Isaacs, and do you know who the other one is?
Who?
Logan Lerman.
Oh, I forgot he's in that.
He's one of the kids.
He's one of the kids.
Yeah.
Wow. Honestly, The Patriot, gift that keeps on giving.
Should we do an episode on The Patriot?
How have we not done The Patriot? Yes. Yes, we should absolutely do that.
Okay, we should do that. All
right.
right.
See, this is literally, we're hey, who's the hot guy that we like this month? Yes, we're doing the next movie about them. That's actually how we make all of our decisions here at Petticoats and Poppies.
It's kind of true.
It's very true. But not to thirst about Jason Isaacs, but there's just something about him in this movie. Has he ever looked more handsome than just being the local lad around the pub with his two pups? And the way he looks at her at the Legion dance.
Oh my
Like,
God.
she could have showed up in a potato sack, and he would have still looked at her the same way. But it was just like the way that he acknowledged the way that she was carrying herself differently because of the dress, and like having that like Cinderella moment at the ball just like made me so happy. And I don't know. I am a sucker for, like, I hate to say this, but like older romances, because he's getting up there in age. He's not like the strapping young, like, you know, romantic lead anymore. But I love older romances and getting to see that like second chance at love. And I love that for this so much. And I did just like swoon over him.
Yeah. Yeah. I wish a man like that would come and talk to me in the casual, you know, neighborhood pub. I
was hanging on every word.
Truly. But no, really, what a beautiful film. This movie is exactly what we need right now. It's so delightful, but also like, I feel like it's one of those movies that you realize at the end of it is actually deeper than you thought it was. I think it actually perfectly captures the magic of the book while also making some improvements to it. Mm. The story is just so heartwarming. I am obsessed with seeing Rose Williams in something. I loved her on Rain. I love her in Sanditon. She's so fun as the like snotty actress. Leslie Manville's performance here is beautiful. It's also really fun to see Leslie Manville play a performance like this. And I got to talk to her. I did a weird series of interviews. Anthony Fabian, Leslie Manville, Lucas Bravo. Wow, what a man. And Ginny Bevan to talk about this movie for Next Best Picture. And you can see my review there too. And, you know, Leslie was talking about how fun it was to play a character who's so different than most of the characters that she plays. She tends to be very like cold characters. And Mrs. Harris is so warm. And it's really nice to see her in a role like this and to see her just absolutely kill it. Obviously, these costumes are gorgeous. Like, you won't make a film about Dior without gorgeous costumes. But I can already tell, like, this is already a comfort movie for me. This is the kind of thing that I think I'm going to watch so many times once I own it on Blu-ray, which I will be buying. Love a Focus Features Blu-ray. So obviously, to talk about this movie, we have to talk about Dior. And obviously. Like, there's no way that we can't. Dior is like, the fashion house itself is like such a character in its own in this movie. And the way that they portray it is honestly so magical, while also like showing the hardship underneath the sort of shiny exterior of the fashion house, which I loved. Dior founded his fashion house in Paris in 1946, but they launched their first collection in 1947. Now, Christian Dior himself is from Granville, France, but his family moved to Paris when he was young, and he attended the École des Sciences Politiques. He was an avid art lover, and he ran a gallery actually before beginning his fashion career. And he had paintings by Georges Braque and a little artist some people might recognize called Pablo Picasso.
Who?
Yeah, right. But whenever he started the label Dior, his goal really was to redefine how women dressed. And so on February 12th, 1947, he released a 90-piece collection to magazine editors at his own Parisian townhouse, and he called it New Look. And it really was a response to the end of the war and the end of fabric rationing, because he had all these very full skirts, really defined waists, and the dresses would use a very indulgent 20 yards of fabric on average. And you really can see, if you look at, sort of silhouettes and photos and stuff from the era, how these dresses were a response to everything else that was going on at the time as the war ended, as we kind of came out of, the hardship of war and went into this sort of excess that would define the 50s for many people. And his brand really quickly was propelled to fame. And that's really because a lot of celebrities wanted to wear his designs. And he actually designed every outfit for Marlene Dietrich in the movie Stage Fright in 1950, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. In 1948, Dior opened his first store on Fifth Avenue in New York City, and sort of made Dior now a worldwide, an international presence. That same year, he launched Miss Dior, his fragrance collection. I actually have a Dior perfume now that I think about it. And he dedicated it to his sister, who during the war had actually fought with the French resistance, which I thought was pretty cool. And he actually died, though, in 1957 of a heart attack. So only like 10 years after founding Dior, Christian Dior himself is gone. And he decided to sort of leave the artistic control of his company to his 21-year-old senior assistant, Yves Saint Laurent, who took the reins. He was actually only there a few years, though, because he gets called up for military duty in 1960 and he leaves. He obviously later goes on to start his own label. But in 1960, Marc Bohan took over and returned to more of Dior's classic vision, because Saint Laurent introduced A-line shapes. He sort of he didn't completely abandon Dior's like artistic vision, but he really moved away from the constrictive shapes that Dior was fond of. And Bohan takes us sort of back to that. From 67 to 75, Dior really blows up. It becomes sort of this more worldwide, more well-known thing because it introduces these ready-to-wear collections. And that's obviously something that's sort of addressed in the movie. So beforehand, everything had been very custom. And they also introduced Baby Dior stores, and Christian Dior Homme is launched, their men's line. In the 1990s, the original line is eventually renamed Christian Dior Couture. Princess Diana actually wore the first couture dress that John Galliano designed in 1996 whenever he became the head of Dior. He's also the one who launched the now obviously very famous Dior saddlebag purses. In 2016, though, Maria Grazia Chiuri became the first woman to be the head of Dior, and I believe she is still at its head today. So they have had a very interesting history, and I think it's very just fascinating to think that Dior is sort of born out of the end of World War II, and what it has come to symbolize in terms of, class and elegance and all of that. And I think that whenever you think of 50s, really, and you think of fashion, a lot of it is rooted in Dior. And I think that that's part of what makes this movie so fun, is getting to see all of that fashion that is now so iconic, but see it sort of through new eyes through Mrs. Harris.
I am always impressed by how well Nicole speaks French on these episodes, and always eternally grateful that she covers things like Dior, so I don't have to butcher every single pronunciation, which is only partially the reason why I chose to discuss Greyhound racing. I mean, are we really surprised that I chose to talk about the aspect of the film that Jason Isaacs was part of? And I also just I genuinely don't think we're going to have another opportunity in the near future to discuss Greyhound racing in the United Kingdom. So I figured now was the best time to talk about this kind of interesting piece of British history. So Greyhound racing became a mainstay in Britain in the 18th century, but attendance really started to peak in around 1946 with around 70 million attendees around the country every year, and something like 196 million pounds being earned cumulatively across all of these different races that were happening throughout the year, which I think is just insane. In the 1940s, there were 77 licensed tracks and over 200 independent tracks around the entire country, with 33 of these based in London. Now, today, that landscape looks very different. There are only around 20 tracks still remaining, with only 3 of them being independent stadiums. And there's a difference between the two, but I felt like that was getting too into the weeds when it came to Greyhound racing. I don't think anybody cares that deeply about it. Greyhound racing was born out of an aspect of hunting where hounds would be set after their prey by sight rather than by scent. At this point, greyhound racing was being called coursing, which is still a phrase used in hunting and certain hunt groups. And that's that practice of having your hound hunt based off of seeing it running rather than scenting. And that first official event took place in 1776 in Norfolk by Lord Orford. So he was the kind of the godfather of greyhound hunting or greyhound racing and coursing hunting. Back then, it would just be a pair of greyhounds that would be set after a live rabbit, and then attendees would bet on which greyhound they thought would reach the rabbit first. It started to evolve. By the late 19th century, it was a larger number of greyhounds who were racing after a fake rabbit that had been scented to smell like a real rabbit. And then, it started to continue to evolve as it became more popular, as things started to modernize. It eventually shifted to being held in oval tracks with mechanical hares, and that was introduced in 1926 by Charles Munn. Obviously, there's a lot to be said about the decline in the industry being linked with what's, very well known with the poor treatment of greyhounds, their shortened lifespans due to their racing, and just the entire sporting industry as a whole is really going through revolution right now. And it makes a lot of sense for why the whole practice is really starting to just shift and change and evolve and go away. But for a really long time, like we see in the movie, this was a very integral part of the British lifestyle, particularly for the working classes. They would go after work, they would have like a fun night out, they would bet, it was just like part of the culture. And as you see with the sheer number of tracks that there were in the 1940s into the 1950s, it was just kind of part of everyday life. So it's interesting to see as things are really like culturally changing that it's on almost non-existent pastime these days. And I mean, they found ways to do more ethical racing and stuff like that. Some digitized greyhound racing is still a thing, but I find greyhound racing really fascinating. I find
digitized greyhound racing.
Yes, digitized greyhound racing.
Oh, that's fascinating.
I find all of the hunt stuff to be really, really fascinating. It's I have a weird niche collection of hunt prints. That's my weird thing that I get at antique shops. I have 20 different hunt prints depicting different hunting scenes from Britain. It's kind of a byproduct of growing up in Virginia where the hunts are still held. So I find it fascinating. And I didn't realize that greyhound racing had come from hunting. I kind of figured it probably had some origin in that, but that it had come directly from it is so interesting because I don't think of greyhounds as hunting dogs.
Yeah.
I think of
That's
hounds.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Right.
And obviously greyhounds, it's a greyhound, but there's something, they don't look like the, iconic.
Stereotypical. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally get that. In the film, Mrs. Harris plans that she's going to go from London to Paris and back in one day. And obviously that's not what ends up happening. She ends up spending more time in Paris. But I was curious, sort of, traveling between London and Paris, what is obviously very easy a day, but what does that look like over time? And originally, if you were going to travel between those two cities, you would typically go from Paris to Calais, and then you would go across the English Channel, land in Dover, and then from there go to London. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, that would take you about 3 days. Of course, you had to deal with seasickness, potential shipwreck, all sorts of other issues, but it was about a 3-day trip, which I think is one of those things that as an American always puts into perspective how small Europe really is. That even in this, 18th century, you could get from London to Paris in 3 days. Do you know how far you could get in the US? Not very far. Unless you were up in New England, I guess. The first nonstop flight between London and Paris was actually in 1911, and it was by 24-year-old pilot Pierre Prieur, which is an incredible name. Well done to his parents for naming him that. And the Fort Wayne Weekly Sentinel newspaper said, Pierre Prieur is a newcomer in international aviation circles. His achievement of today, however, in flying a monoplane from London to the suburbs of Paris, places him in the ranks of the world's foremost airmen. And so that sort of opened up this idea that it was possible to fly directly from London to Paris. Now, the first international passenger flight took place on August 25th, 1919 from London to Paris. It was operated by Air Transport and Travel, which is sort of a predecessor of nowadays British Airways. It took off from Hounslow Heath, which is actually near where Heathrow Airport sits today. But this flight didn't really become common until after World War II. But in the post-war years, they actually did have a regular flight going between Paris and London, as we see Mrs. Harris take in the film. There was another way that you could get from London to Paris at the time, though. And obviously, we know that today there's the Eurostar. I actually, when I was living in London, did take the Eurostar to Paris for my spring break, which was very fun. Got to go through the Channel and everything. And then I also took it once to go outside of Paris to Disneyland. But I discovered there was this thing called the night ferry. And it was a boat train, essentially. You could get on, or get off at London Victoria, and it went to Paris's Gare du Nord. And you used a train ferry to cross the English Channel. It ran from 1936 to 1939, and then it was shut down during the war years. By 1947, actually the same year that Christian Dior, launches his fashion brand, it opened back up and it ran until 1980. And it was run by first Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits, and then later by British Rail. But basically, how it worked from what I could understand from what I read is that if you were just a normal passenger, you would get on the train at, London Victoria. You'd go to where the ferry took off. You'd get off the train and you'd get on the ferry. And then whenever you got on the other side, you'd get on that one. But the first class sleeping cars and the dining cars and the baggage would literally go onto the ferry, get deconnected from the train, go onto the ferry across the English Channel, and then on the other side, get connected up to the train on that side, which is wild. I don't know, the idea of being on a ferry on a train is so strange. But I was just very fascinated by that. I think that, the fact that London and Paris are actually so close together is really fascinating to me. But yeah, so definitely at the time, the way that we see her going to Paris on this airplane is actually very accurate. But she would have had options to choose from. Obviously, she was choosing to go by air because that would have been the quickest way to get there even at that time.
I have not traveled to Paris, so I am very fascinated to know how you can get between the two. I have been reading, though, about those poor people who got stuck abroad and they're having a terrible time getting back to the UK because of all the flight cancellations. And Paris said that they couldn't come into Paris to take the train. They were like, nah, you're going to have to stay in your country that you're visiting and find another way. But there's so many modes of transportation. It's a tragedy, really. And again, another episode of me going, there's really no easy way to segue from whatever Nicole was just talking about into costumes. So, of course, you could not talk about a movie like this without discussing costumes. The costumes were designed by Academy Award winner Jenny Bevan. She's, of course, best known for doing the costumes on the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes films, which are some of my favorites. She also costumed Casanova, which is one of my favorite films. She did The King's Speech, which is another one of my favorite films. And she's also working on the most recent upcoming Mad Max film that Chris Hemsworth is in, and Anya Taylor-Joy. And I think it's just kind of funny to see the contrast, because she's done all of the most recent Mad Max movies. And then you have these beautiful costumes with Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. And I think I love somebody who can do the duality of costuming. Absolutely. It makes me a lot of joy. It brings me a lot of joy. So she worked with the Dior archives to make replicas of the dresses inspired by his signature styles in the 1950s. She revealed in an interview with Focus Features that she had actually thought that Dior was going to be providing Dior dresses for this movie. And she was really surprised when she was invited to visit the archives at the House of Dior, and they were like, so here's what you can use as a base and example for what you're going to be working on. And it was at that moment that she realized that she was going to be the one creating the replica dresses. And she praised all of the people who worked in her costume shop, who worked really diligently on matching all of the styles and silhouettes that go along with what made Dior in the 1950s. In another interview, I found that Leslie was talking about how important Ada's hat was, which I thought was really interesting. She liked that it felt homemade and like she had created it herself. And I thought that was really interesting because I think it really threads an interesting line with the idea that she knows how to make these things. I'm sure if she really wanted to, she could probably make herself a dress that looked like a Christian Dior dress. She showed herself to have very capable, sewing skills at Dior when she kind of bridged that divide with, I can't remember what his name is, but the mean fitter.
Yep.
And so like I think it's just interesting that like she's savvy. She knows how to make these things herself, but like she still wants that finery. She still wants that thing that is, something to covet, which I think is really interesting. And like I loved everything about these costumes. I loved that her everyday clothes weren't drab, that they still very much embraced like her joy for life with florals and bright, cheery patterns that just really fit her personality and also were very accurate for the time period. I was chuffed with everything about these costumes. Every part of them were beautiful and the silhouettes were great and everything was historically accurate. And it just brought me a lot of visual joy.
Yeah, these costumes are like gorgeous. If anyone else is a costumes nerd, like both of us are, you've got to see this movie. If you haven't already at the time of listening to this.
Truly. I love a good movie that has a good story and a really solid cast and is just beautiful. And there was some really interesting stuff that they did with like scene direction and scene composition. And some of the cuts between scenes were like really inventive and took me by surprise in a lot of ways. And I was just thrilled.
Does it make sense if I say that in some ways this movie reminds me of the Paddington movies?
Oh yeah, 100%. It has that same feel good, happy, like vibes.
But also like not so feel good and happy that it feels frivolous. Like it feels like there's like emotional weight to it.
And also care about the characters.
Right. And it also feels so British. Like even though half the movie takes place in France, this movie feels so British, which I love.
Did you think that Lucas Bravo looked like a young Matthew Good?
Yes.
Particularly with the glasses. And maybe this is because I had like just recently watched The Offer and he's got like the 70s glasses, which aren't that dissimilar from like the 50s glasses. But I kept looking at this man and I was like, you would be so good at playing Matthew Good's son.
Right? Like
the vibe.
Or
and
younger
like
brother, something like put them together, folks.
Yes. Like this right here, this is the same man in a slightly different font. This is a cursive version.
It was so interesting whenever I talked to him, because he was basically talking about how, he'd done Emily in Paris.
I'm well aware of that.
Or sorry, Emily in Paris.
Yes.
God. And he was really excited to take on a role where he felt he would be playing a character that had more to him than just essentially he basically was like, I'm going to do more than just be objectified. And I was like,
he should become friends with Reggie Jean Page.
Yeah. But I thought that was really interesting. And I do think though that this movie actually like gives him a really interesting like chance to play a character that's has a bit more to him.
I was obsessed with the existentialism conversations.
What a man. What a man. Yeah, but God, all these characters are so good. Like Ada's like bestie back home.
Yes.
Her. But yeah, thank you everyone for listening to our 44th episode of Petticoats and Poppies. Be sure to also, if you want to, check out my review of Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris, and the interviews that I mentioned, which are at Next Best Picture.
Yes, and we would love to hear from you on social media and to hear what you think of Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris.
And honestly, like what your moms think of Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris.
Yes, because I'm sure your mother loved them.
This is an ideal mom movie. And I can say that as, you know, a registered mom before my time. You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie over at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the Ergly Media website, and of course on Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating over on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, and of course on Spotify. Every few episodes, we'll be reading our reviews, so be sure to leave us one if you would like to be featured.
We'll be back soon with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective. It's so nice to talk about a good movie.
Au revoir.
You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Well, another thing that I was interesting? What? Another thing that I was
You're
interested
very
in.
interesting, Nicole.
Thank you.